The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Ukrainian countryside, blanketing the fields in white that stretched endlessly toward a horizon where the sky and earth became indistinguishable. It was a kind of cold that penetrated through layers of clothing, through skin and muscle, settling deep into the bones until it felt like the cold was part of you, inseparable and eternal. In a small village called Biela Tserkva, about 80 kilometers south of Kiev, a young woman stood at the window of a modest wooden house, watching the snow accumulate on the bare branches of the apple trees in the yard. Her breath fogged the glass, and she wiped it away with her sleeve, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that only she could see. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, but everyone called her Mila. She was 24 years old in the winter of 1941, and if you had asked anyone in her village to describe her, they would have told you she was unremarkable, average height, with dark blonde hair that she kept braided and pinned close to her head, gray-blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, and a quiet demeanor that made her easy to overlook in a crowd. She worked at the Kiev Arsenal factory, operating machinery that produced artillery shells for the Red Army, and she lived alone in a house that had belonged to her grandmother, who had died the previous autumn. But there was something about Mila that people didn't see, something that existed beneath the surface of her ordinary life. She had a stillness about her, a patience that was unusual in someone so young, and when she focused on something, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, and she had an ability to wait, to remain motionless for hours if necessary. That seemed almost inhuman. These qualities had served her well in her secret passion. The things she did when no one was watching, the skills she had been developing since she was 14 years old. Mila was a shooter, not just someone who could fire a rifle, but a true marksman, someone who understood the mathematics of ballistics, the physics of wind and gravity, the psychology of patience and timing. She had learned to shoot from her grandfather, a veteran of the First World War, who had recognized in his quiet granddaughter a natural talent that he had spent years cultivating. He had taught her everything he knew, and she had absorbed it all with a hunger that surprised even him. By the time she was 18, she could hit a target at 300 meters with iron sights, could calculate windage and elevation adjustments in her head, could control her breathing and heartbeat to the point where her body became a stable platform for perfect accuracy. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been dismissed because of who you are rather than what you can do, if you've ever wanted to prove that the people who mocked you were catastrophically wrong, then subscribe right now. Because this is the story of a woman who was laughed at when she volunteered to fight, who was told that women couldn't be soldiers, who was given a rifle as a joke, and then proceeded to become the most feared sniper the Nazis ever faced. Stay until the end, because what she accomplished will change the way you think about courage, about skill, and about what it means to be deadly. The German invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941, and it came with a speed and ferocity that shocked the world. Operation Barbarossa, as the Germans called it, involved over 3 million troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and a strategy designed to crush Soviet resistance in a matter of weeks. The initial assault was devastating, with German forces advancing hundreds of kilometers in the first days, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and driving toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. Mila heard about the invasion on the radio, listening to the announcements that tried to maintain calm while barely concealing the panic underneath. The Soviet Union was unprepared for this assault. Despite warnings from intelligence services, despite the obvious buildup of German forces along the border, Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break their non-aggression pact, and now the Red Army was paying the price for that miscalculation. Within days, German forces were advancing toward Kiev, and the city where Mila worked was directly in their path. The factory where Mila worked was evacuated, with the machinery and workers being relocated further east to prevent them from falling into German hands. But Mila didn't go with them. Instead, she went to military recruitment office in Kiev and volunteered to join the Red Army. She walked into the office carrying her grandfather's rifle, a Mosin-Nagant model 1891/30 that he had used in the First World War and had given to her before he died. It was a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round internal magazine, chambered in 7.62x54 mm, with iron sights that Mila had learned to use with devastating accuracy. The recruitment officer was a middle-aged man with a tired face and the look of someone who had been processing volunteers for days without sleep. He looked up when Mila entered, took in her appearance, the rifle she was carrying, and his expression shifted from exhaustion to something between amusement and irritation. "We're not accepting women," he said, his tone making it clear that he considered this self-evident and not worth discussing. "I can shoot," Mila replied, her voice quiet but firm. The officer laughed, a short, harsh sound. "I'm sure you can. Go home, girl. This is a war, not a shooting competition. We need soldiers, not factory workers playing with their grandfather's rifles." Mila didn't move. She stood there, holding the rifle, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the officer with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Test me," she said. "Give me a target. If I can't hit it, I'll leave. If I can, you enlist me." The officer sighed, clearly wanting to dismiss her, but also aware that there were other people in the office watching this exchange, and he didn't want to appear unreasonable. "Fine," he said. "There's a range out back. You get 3 shots. If you can hit the target at 200 meters, I'll consider it." He said it as if it were an impossible challenge, as if he were humoring a child. 200 meters with iron sights was difficult even for trained soldiers, and he clearly expected this young woman to fail spectacularly and then leave him alone. He led her out to the range behind the building, where there were targets set up at various distances. A small crowd of soldiers and other volunteers followed, curious to see this woman who thought she could shoot. The officer pointed to a target at 200 meters, a standard military silhouette target. "There," he said. 3 shots. Let's see what you can do." Mila walked the firing line, and a crowd of onlookers began making comments, some amused, some derisive. "She's going to hurt herself," one soldier said. "Someone should take that rifle away before she shoots her own foot." Another added, "This is what happens when we let women think they could be soldiers." A third commented, and there was laughter. Mila ignored them all. She had learned long ago to tune out distractions, to create a bubble of silence around herself where only she and the target existed. She checked the rifle, confirmed it was loaded, and then took her position. She stood rather than lying prone, because she wanted to make this more impressive, wanted to show them that she could hit the target under less than ideal conditions. She brought the rifle to her shoulder, her movements smooth and practiced. She controlled her breathing, taking slow, deep breaths, and then she began the process her grandfather had taught her. She found the target in her sights, made minute adjustments for wind and distance, and then she entered that state of perfect stillness where her heartbeat slowed and the world narrowed to a single point of focus. The first shot rang out, the sharp crack of the Mosin-Nagin echoing across the range. Through the scope that wasn't there, through iron sights that required perfect alignment, Mila had placed a round center mass on the target. The officer walked down range with binoculars, checked the target, and his expression changed from amused condescension to surprise. "Center mass," he called back. "Lucky shot." Mila didn't respond. She simply chambered another round, the bolt action smooth and fast, and fired again. Another crack, another perfect stillness before and after the shot. The officer checked again. "Center mass," he said, and now his voice had lost its mocking tone. The third shot was the same. Perfect placement, center mass, exactly where Mila had intended. The crowd of soldiers had gone quiet, the jokes and laughter dying away as they realized they were watching something extraordinary. This wasn't a lucky shot or beginner's luck. This was skill, real and undeniable skill, the kind that took years to develop. The officer walked back on the target range, and when he reached Mila, his entire demeanor had changed. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. "My grandfather," Mila replied. "He was a sniper in the Great War. He taught me everything." The officer nodded slowly, and then he made a decision that would change the course of Mila's life and, in small but significant ways, the course of the war. "All right," he said. "You're enlisted. Report to the 25th Rifle Division. They're forming sniper units, and they need people who can actually shoot." The soldiers who had been mocking her minutes before were now silent, some looking embarrassed, others looking at her with new respect. One of them, a young man about her age, approached her as she was leaving. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said. That was incredible shooting. Mila looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled slightly. Don't apologize, she said. Just remember that you can't tell what someone can do by looking at them. The Germans are going to learn that lesson too. Mila was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division, which was part of the defense of Odessa, the major port city on the Black Sea that the Germans and their Romanian allies were besieging. The journey to Odessa took 3 days, traveling in overcrowded trains and trucks, moving through a landscape that was already showing the scars of war. Villages burned. Refugees fled eastward with whatever possessions they could carry, and the roads were clogged with military vehicles moving toward the front. When Mila arrived in Odessa in August of 1941, the city was under constant bombardment. German and Romanian forces had surrounded the city on the landward side, and they were conducting a siege, shelling the city with artillery and bombing from the air, trying to force a surrender. The Soviet defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were fighting with desperate determination, knowing that if Odessa fell, the entire southern front could collapse. Mila reported to her unit, and was immediately struck by the chaos and confusion. The Red Army in 1941 was still reeling from the initial German assault, still trying to reorganize and adapt to a kind of warfare that was faster and more brutal than anything they had prepared for. Officers were overwhelmed. Supplies were scarce, and there was a sense of barely controlled panic that permeated everything. When Mila presented herself to her commanding officer, a captain named Volkov, who looked like he hadn't slept in days, he looked at her with the same skepticism she had encountered at the recruitment office. "You're the sniper?" he asked, his tone making it clear he had doubts. "Yes, sir," Mila replied. "You're a woman," Volkov said, as if this were news to her. "Yes, sir." Volkov sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, I don't have time for this. We're barely holding the line, and I need every soldier I can get. But snipers are specialists. They work alone or in pairs. They need to be able to survive behind enemy lines, and they need to be able to kill without hesitation. Are you sure you can do this?" "Yes, sir," Mila said, her voice steady. Volkov studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Fine. You'll be paired with Sergeant Kozlov. He's an experienced sniper, and he'll evaluate you. If he says you can do the job, you stay. If not, you'll be reassigned to a regular rifle unit." "Understood." "Yes, sir." Sergeant Kozlov was a man in his 30s, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who had seen too much combat. When Volkov introduced Mila as his new partner, Kozlov's reaction was immediate and negative. "A woman," he said. "Captain, with respect, this is insane. Sniping isn't like regular combat. It requires physical endurance, the ability to remain motionless for hours, the mental toughness to kill at close range and then escape. Women can't do this." "Test her," Volkov said, using the same words Mila had used at the recruitment office. "If she can't do the job, we'll reassign her. But give her a chance." Kozlov looked at Mila with barely concealed hostility. "Fine," he said. "Tomorrow morning, we go out. There's a Romanian position about 400 meters from our lines. They have a machine gun nest that's been causing us problems. If you can take out the gunner, you pass. If you can't, you go back to being a regular soldier." That night, Mila couldn't sleep. She lay in the basement of a bombed-out building that was serving as barracks for her unit, listening to the distant sound of artillery fire, and she thought about what she was about to do. She had shot targets, had killed animals while hunting, but she had never killed a human being. She tried to imagine what it would feel like, tried to prepare herself mentally for the reality of taking a life, and she found that she couldn't quite grasp it. It was abstract, theoretical, something she knew intellectually, but couldn't fully comprehend emotionally. The next morning, before dawn, Kozlov came to get her. He handed her a scope Mosin Nagant, a sniper variant with a 3.5 XPU scope, and a pouch with extra ammunition. "We move quietly, we move carefully," he said. "The Romanians have patrols, and if they spot us, we're dead. Follow my lead, do exactly what I do, and maybe we'll both survive this." They left the Soviet lines through a gap in the defenses, crawling through rubble and ruins, moving slowly and carefully through no man's land between the two armies. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the devastated landscape. Buildings that had once been homes and shops were now hollow shells, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes, their roofs collapsed. The streets were littered with debris, with the detritus of war, and the smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air. Kozlov led them to a position in the upper floor of a partially collapsed apartment building, where they had a clear line of sight to the Romanian machine gun nest. They settled into position, and Kozlov used binoculars to observe the enemy position. "There," he said quietly, pointing. "The machine gun is in that sandbag position. The gunner changes every 2 hours. When the new gunner takes position, that's your shot. You'll have maybe 10 seconds before they realize what's happening and start returning fire. 1 shot, and then we move." "Understood." "Understood," Mila whispered. They waited. Kozlov had been right about the physical demands of sniping. They lay motionless in their position for over an hour, barely breathing, ignoring the discomfort of the hard floor and the cramped space. Mila felt her muscles beginning to ache, felt the urge to shift position, to stretch, but she forced herself to remain still. This was what her grandfather had taught her, this patience, this ability to become part of the environment, to wait for the perfect moment. Finally, there was movement at the Romanian position. A soldier emerged from a trench and made his way to the machine gun nest. He was young. Mila could see through her scope, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair and a thin face. He settled into position behind the machine gun, adjusting the weapon, checking the ammunition belt, completely unaware that he was being watched. "That's your target," Kozlov whispered. "Take the shot when you're ready." Mila centered the crosshairs on the Romanian soldier's chest. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and she entered that state of perfect focus that she had practiced for years. The world narrowed to just her and the target, everything else fading away. She could see the soldier's face clearly through the scope, could see that he was talking to someone, maybe joking, maybe complaining about the early morning shift. And then she realized something that made her hesitate. This wasn't a target. This was a person. A human being with thoughts and feelings, with a family somewhere, with hopes and dreams and fears. In a few seconds, if she pulled the trigger, all of that would end. She would end it. She would take this person's life, would transform him from a living, breathing human being into a corpse, and she would do it from a distance, safely hidden, without giving him any chance to defend himself or even know what was happening. "What are you waiting for?" Kozlov hissed. "Take the shot." Mila's finger was on the trigger, but she couldn't pull it. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. She thought about her grandfather, about the stories he had told her about the First World War, about the men he had killed. He had told her that the first one was the hardest, that after that became easier, that you learned to see the enemy as targets rather than people. Because if you didn't, you couldn't do the job. She thought about the German invasion, about the villages she had seen burning, about the refugees fleeing with terror in her eyes, about the reports of atrocities, of civilians being murdered, of entire communities being wiped out. She thought about the fact that if she didn't pull this trigger, that machine gun would kill Soviet soldiers, would kill people who were defending their homeland, would contribute to the German and Romanian advance that was destroying everything she knew. And she pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the sharp crack of the shot echoing across the ruins. Through the scope, Mila saw the Romanian soldier jerk backward, saw the red bloom spreading across his chest, saw him collapse behind the sandbags. For a moment, there was silence, and then chaos erupted at the Romanian position. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. "Move!" Kozlov commanded, and they were up and running, scrambling down the stairs of the building, moving through the ruins as fast as they could while staying low. Behind them, they could hear the Romanians opening fire, bullets whining through the air, impacting on walls and rubble. But Kozlov knew the terrain, knew the routes back to Soviet lines, and within minutes they were back in friendly territory, breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Kozlov looked at Mila, and his expression had changed. The hostility was gone, replaced by something like respect. "You hesitated," he said, "but you took the shot. That's what matters. The hesitation will go away. It always does." Mila nodded, but she wasn't sure she wanted the hesitation to go away. She wasn't sure she wanted to become someone who could kill without feeling anything. But she also knew that Kozlov was right, that in war, hesitation could get you killed, could get your comrades killed, and that if she was going to survive and be effective, she would have to learn to pull the trigger without thinking about the person on the other end of the rifle. That first kill haunted Mila for days. She would close her eyes and see the Romanian soldier's face, would see the moment of impact, would replay the shot over and over in her mind. She had nightmares where the soldier was still alive, where he was looking at her, asking her why, and she would wake up in the darkness of the basement barracks, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. But Kozlov had been right about one thing. It did get easier. Not because Mila stopped seeing the enemy as human beings, but because she learned to compartmentalize, to separate the act of shooting from the emotional weight of killing. She learned to focus on the tactical aspects, on the wind and distance and timing, on the mission and the objective, and to push the moral questions into a corner of her mind where they couldn't interfere with her ability to function. Over the next 2 months, during the siege of Odessa, Mila became one of the most effective snipers in her division. She and Kozlov worked together, hunting enemy soldiers, taking out officers and machine gunners and artillery observers, disrupting Romanian and German operations. Mila's kill count began to climb. 5, then 10, then 20. Each one was recorded, verified by Kozlov or other witnesses, documented in the official records. The other soldiers in her unit began to treat her differently. The mockery and skepticism disappeared, replaced by a kind of wary respect. They had seen what she could do, had seen enemy soldiers fall to her rifle, and they understood that she was not someone to be underestimated. Some of them were uncomfortable with her, with the idea of a woman killing so efficiently, but most came to accept her as a valuable member of the unit, someone who was contributing to their survival and their mission. In October 1941, the Soviet High Command made the decision to evacuate Odessa. The city had held out longer than anyone expected, tying down significant Romanian and German forces. But it was clear that it couldn't be held indefinitely. The evacuation was conducted by sea, with the Black Sea Fleet transporting the defenders and as many civilians as possible to Sevastopol in Crimea, where a new defensive line was being established. Mila was evacuated with her unit, and she arrived in Sevastopol to find another city under siege, another desperate defensive battle. But here, her reputation had preceded her. Word had spread about the female sniper from Odessa, about her kill count and her effectiveness, and she was assigned to a specialized sniper unit that was being formed to defend the city. Sevastopol would be Mila's home for the next 8 months, and it would be where she truly became legendary. The siege of Sevastopol was one of the longest and bloodiest of the entire war, with German forces conducting a massive assault using heavy artillery, aerial bombardment, and repeated infantry attacks. The Soviet defenders fought with incredible tenacity, holding out for 250 days against overwhelming odds. Mila operated throughout the siege, moving through the ruins of the city, hunting German soldiers with methodical precision. She developed techniques and tactics that would later be taught to other snipers, learning how to use the urban environment to her advantage, how to create multiple firing positions and move between them, how to work with a spotter to identify high-value targets, how to survive in a combat zone where death could come from any direction at any moment. Her kill count continued to climb, 50, then 100, then 150. Each kill was verified, documented, added to her official record. She became known to the Germans, who put a price on her head, who sent their own snipers to hunt her. She survived multiple attempts on her life, killed several German snipers in counter-sniper duels, and continued to operate with a calm efficiency that was both admired and feared. But the siege took its toll. Mila watched friends die, watched the city she was defending being systematically destroyed, watched civilians starve and freeze and die from disease and bombardment. She saw the worst of war, the brutality and the waste and the senseless destruction, and she felt something inside her hardening, becoming cold and distant. The nightmare stopped, not because she had made peace with what she was doing, but because she had learned to shut down the part of herself that felt guilt and horror. In June of 1942, Mila was wounded by mortar fire. Shrapnel tore through her left side, and she was evacuated from Sevastopol just days before the city finally fell to the Germans. She was taken to a hospital in the rear, where doctors worked to save her life. She survived, but her combat days were over. The wounds were too severe, and she would never regain full mobility on her left side. By the time she was wounded, Mila's official kill count stood at 309 confirmed kills, making her the most successful female sniper in history and one of the most successful snipers of World War II regardless of gender. She had accomplished in less than a year what most snipers couldn't accomplish in an entire war, and she had done it while facing skepticism, mockery, and discrimination at every turn. After her recovery, Mila was withdrawn from combat and sent on a propaganda tour, first within the Soviet Union and then to Allied countries. She traveled to the United States in 1942, where she met with President Franklin Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, gave speeches at rallies and universities, and helped raise support for the Soviet war effort. American audiences were fascinated by her, by this young woman who had killed over 300 enemy soldiers, and she became a celebrity, featured in newspapers and magazines, interviewed on radio programs. But Mila hated the publicity. She was uncomfortable with being turned into a propaganda symbol, with having her story simplified and sanitized for public consumption. She wanted to be back at the front, back with her unit, back doing the work she had trained for, but her wounds made that impossible. And she had to accept that her war was over, that she would spend the rest of the conflict training other snipers and serving as a symbol rather than as a soldier. The American tour was surreal for Mila. She was treated like a hero, given awards and honors, invited to fancy dinners and receptions. But she felt like a fraud, like she was being celebrated for something that shouldn't be celebrated, for killing, for taking lives. She gave speeches about the importance of defeating fascism, about the courage of the Soviet people, about the need for the Allies to open a second front in Europe. But inside she felt empty, disconnected from the words she was saying. One moment from the American tour stayed with Mila for the rest of her life. She was at a reception in Washington, D.C., surrounded by politicians and military officers and society women, and one of the women approached her and asked, in a tone of fascinated horror, "What does it feel like to kill someone?" Mila looked at this woman, with her expensive dress and her carefully styled hair and her complete ignorance of what war actually meant, and she felt a surge of anger so intense it surprised her. "It feels like I'm defending my country," she said, her voice cold. "It feels like I'm stopping the people who are murdering my people, burning my cities, trying to enslave my nation. It feels necessary." Does that answer your question? The woman had backed away, uncomfortable, and Mila had realized that these people didn't really want to know what war was like. They wanted the sanitized version, the heroic story, the narrative that made them feel good about supporting the war effort. They didn't want to hear about the nightmares, about the moral weight of killing, about the way war destroyed not just bodies, but souls. Eleanor Roosevelt was different. The First Lady spent time with Mila, talked to her not as a curiosity, but as a person, asked her real questions about her experiences and her thoughts. They formed an unlikely friendship, these two women from completely different worlds, and Eleanor became one of the few people Mila felt she could be honest with about the psychological cost of what she had done. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked her during one of their private conversations. "Do you regret becoming a sniper?" Mila thought about this question for a long time before answering. "I regret that it was necessary," she finally said. "I regret that the world is such that someone like me had to exist, had to do what I did. But do I regret my choice to fight? No. If I hadn't fought, if I had stayed home and tried to survive, I would have regretted that more. At least this way, I did something. I made a difference, even if it was a terrible kind of difference." Mila returned to the Soviet Union in 1943 and spent the rest of the war training snipers, passing on the techniques and tactics she had developed. She trained hundreds of snipers, both male and female, and many of them went on to become highly effective in combat. She also completed her education, studying history at Kiev University, and after the war she became a historian, researching and writing about the Soviet experience in World War II. But the war never really left her. She had nightmares for the rest of her life, dreams where she was back in Odessa or Sevastopol, back in the ruins with her rifle, back in that state of heightened awareness where every shadow could be an enemy, every sound could be a threat. She had trouble forming close relationships, had trouble trusting people, had trouble feeling emotions the way she had before the war. The coldness that helped her survive combat had become a permanent part of her personality, and she struggled to reconnect with the person she had been before she learned to kill. Mila was awarded numerous honors and decorations, including the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could bestow. She was celebrated as a war hero, as a symbol of Soviet courage and determination, as proof that women could fight as effectively as men. But she was ambivalent about these honors, feeling that they celebrated something that shouldn't be celebrated, that they turned killing into glory when it should be recognized as tragedy. In her later years, Mila became an advocate for peace, speaking out against war and militarism, arguing that her experiences had taught her that war was never glorious, never heroic, always destructive and dehumanizing. She wrote memoirs and gave interviews, trying to convey the reality of combat, the psychological cost of killing, the way war damaged everyone it touched. She was particularly concerned about the way her story was being told, the way she was being portrayed as a fearless warrior who had killed without hesitation or remorse. She wanted people to understand that she had hesitated, that she had felt remorse, that every kill had taken something from her, had chipped away at her humanity. She wanted people to understand that being good at killing didn't make you a hero, that the real heroism was in the choice to fight despite the cost, despite knowing what it would do to you. People think that because I killed 309 enemy soldiers, I must be some kind of monster, she said in an interview in the 1970s. Or they think I must be some kind of superhero, fearless and invincible. But I was neither. I was just a person who learned a skill and used it in a situation where it was necessary. I was terrified most of the time. I had nightmares. I questioned what I was doing, but I kept doing it because the alternative was worse. Because if I didn't fight, the Nazis would win, and that was unacceptable. Mila died in 1974 at the age of 58. Her health having been compromised by her war wounds and by the stress and trauma she had endured. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people, including many of the snipers she had trained, and she was buried with full military honors. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage for veterans and for people who wanted to honor her memory and her service. In the decades since her death, Mila's story has been told and retold, in books and films and documentaries. She has become a symbol of female empowerment, of the ability of women to excel in traditionally male domains, of the courage to fight back against oppression and tyranny. But these retellings often miss the complexity of her story, the moral ambiguity, the psychological cost, the way she struggled with what she had done and what she had become, the soldiers who mocked her when she first volunteered, who laughed at her rifle and told her to go home, had been catastrophically wrong. Mila had proven that women could be soldiers, could be snipers, could be as deadly and effective as any man. But she had also proven something more important, that being deadly came at a cost, that killing changed you in ways that couldn't be undone, that war was not glorious or heroic, but brutal and dehumanizing. Her legacy is complicated. She is celebrated as a hero, and in many ways she was. She fought against fascism, defended her country, saved lives by taking lives. But she also paid a terrible price for that service, losing parts of herself that she could never get back, carrying trauma and guilt that haunted her for the rest of her life. She wanted people to remember both sides of that story, to understand that heroism and tragedy were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. The title Deadliest Female Sniper is accurate, but it's also reductive. It reduces Mila to a kill count, to a statistic, when she was so much more than that. She was a person who made a choice to fight, who developed extraordinary skills, who endured unimaginable hardship, who struggled with the moral weight of what she did, who tried to make sense of her experiences, who wanted her story to be a warning as much as an inspiration. When soldiers mocked her rifle, they were mocking not just her, but the idea that a woman could be a warrior. They were expressing the prejudice and discrimination that women have faced throughout history, the assumption that women are weak, that they can't handle combat, that they don't belong in war. Mila proved them wrong in the most definitive way possible, by becoming more effective than most of them could ever hope to be. But she also proved something else, that the ability to kill doesn't make you superior, that being good at war doesn't make you a better person, that the real measure of someone is not how many enemies they can kill, but how they handle the moral and psychological challenges of doing so. Mila handled those challenges with honesty and integrity. refusing to pretend that killing was easy or glorious, insisting that people understand the full cost of what she had done. Her story resonates today because it challenges our assumptions about gender, about war, about heroism. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what we celebrate and why, about whether we should honor people for their ability to kill, about the difference between necessary violence and glorified violence. It reminds us that the people we dismiss and underestimate can be the most capable, that prejudice blinds us to potential, that we should judge people by what they can do rather than by our assumptions about who they are. Mila Pavlichenko was 24 years old when she became a sniper, and she was 25 when her combat career ended. In that brief time, she accomplished something extraordinary, something that most people couldn't imagine doing. But she also paid a price that most people couldn't imagine paying. And she spent the rest of her life trying to make sense of what she had done and what it had cost her. She taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. She taught us that skill and determination can overcome prejudice and discrimination. She taught us that women are capable of anything men are capable of, including the terrible work of war. And she taught us that being good at killing is not something to celebrate without also acknowledging the cost, the trauma, the moral weight that comes with taking human life. When soldiers mock her rifle, they were making a mistake that would cost their enemies dearly. But more than that, they were revealing their own limitations, their own prejudices, their own inability to see past surface appearances to the potential underneath. Mila saw past those limitations, proved them wrong, and in doing so became not just the deadliest female sniper in history, but a symbol of what people can accomplish when they refuse to accept others' limitations, when they insist on their own worth, when they choose to fight for what they believe in despite the cost. Her story is not a simple tale of heroism. It's a complex narrative about choice and consequence, about skill and trauma, about the price of war and the cost of survival. It's a story that should make us think, should make us question, should make us understand that the people we celebrate as heroes are often people who paid terrible prices for their actions, who carry burdens we can't see, who deserve our respect not just for what they accomplished, but for how they handle the moral and psychological challenges of their experiences. Mila Pavlichenko became the deadliest female sniper against the Nazis, but she also became a voice for peace, a witness to the cause of war, a reminder that killing, even necessary killing, even justified killing, always comes with a price. That's the full story, the complete picture, the truth that she wanted people to understand. And that's the legacy she left behind, a legacy that challenges us to think more deeply about war, about heroism, about what it means to fight and what it costs to survive.